to take your point about pornography, which I think is totally valid, you could have a completely rational conversation in terms of human psychology and sociology and what you want society to look like about the corrosive nature of pornography, right? That's not, you don't have to be a Victorian prude to worry that there might be something wrong with the infinite availability of pornography to 13-year-olds and above, right? I mean, that's I don't know what generation of human beings we're raising in the current environment. It's quite worrisome, actually. But again, you don't have to invoke mythology to do that. And I would say the temptation to invoke mythology, to say, well, you actually,
So how do you do it?
Poseidon really gets pissed off when you masturbate.
How do you do it? How do you do it?
We
don't have a mechanism. We have no mechanism for controlling that.
Talk about the effects on human relationships and your own mind and your own intention and the way you view other people.
Sam, that barely works for sex ed. It barely works for condom education.
What was that?
It barely works. Like those sorts of educational interventions to stop that kind of fundamental behavior have very little effect. Well, people aren't nearly as amenable to behavioral changes as a consequence of rational educational interventions as you might hope. I mean, and that's part and parcel of very broad clinical literature.
They're not as amenable to dogmatic intrusions either. I mean,
they are, and that might be a problem. And there are problems with that.
Well, no, because they're, again, this is just
like the terror of God in that situation. This is all going in.
The problem is that even if you could make the case that a dogmatic attachment to one or another religion was better, all things considered, than being secular, truly secular and truly rational, right? It's vulnerable. It's vulnerable to every next thing we find out. I mean, that's why it's like you could have said, if you go back, 200 years before the germ theory of disease, you could have said, well, all of these dietary taboos and taboos around, hand washing and foot washing, it's actually very wise. The wisdom of the germ theory of disease was sort of built into our scripture, and people were there was a kind of differential level of survival based on those who really adhered to these practices and those who didn't. Okay, but it's blind to the actual variables, like there's nothing special about shellfish necessarily, or there's nothing special about pork necessarily, or whatever the example is. And once you get the actual variables in hand, then the whole edifice comes crashing down, and then you really just want to understand the variables that work.
Look, I don't know if the whole edifice comes crashing down, and it isn't clear to me that you want to claim that, because one of the things you did say in the moral landscape, and I think this is associated with your interest in spirituality, is that there is some baby mixed in with the bathwater. And the question is, how do we distill that out?
Yeah.
And the objections that you're raising are the objections that are, look how difficult it is to do the distillation. It's like, yeah, absolutely, man. And it's not like I'm a foe of the Enlightenment. I think you Enlightenment types, and I put Pinker in the same camp, radically overestimate the degree to that was a casus sui. It's like everyone was barbaric and superstitious until 1750, and some miracle occurred, and now we all became enlightened. Like there was a lengthy developmental history
clearly
of
we
that.
all haven't. I mean, this is hence our complaining about the problem. And most of the world hasn't had the Enlightenment yet.
True.
On some level.
Look, I'm no foe to the Enlightenment, but I think that it had a lengthy developmental history that is radically underplayed by the people who ground it purely in rationality.
It's clearly still developing. My point is, we should be able to agree that having a worldview guided by a continuous, honest engagement with reality insofar as we can apprehend it is better than having a worldview solidified or anchored to unchanging ideas that were born of people who had none of our present tools, none of our present insights into anything.